Morning to today's webinar, the webinar that nearly wasn't a webinar. Sarah and I have had some fun behind the scenes as we've just had a fire alarm go off in our building, and there were chances that this wasn't going to occur, but luckily it was just a drill. So welcome anyway. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I was going to say there'll be no fire drills today. That's what they normally say, but actually, to the contrary. Questions and answers. We do have, you're all muted for today's session, but we do have a Q&A feature, which should be somewhere near, I think, the top right of your screen. If you'd like to type any questions in as we go along, and then Sarah and I will address any of those if we can answer them at the end. The session will be, or is being recorded, so if anybody would like a copy of that, I believe we send it out anyway to the attendees, but you will receive that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest today. So Sarah is one of our, or Old Square Chambers has been one of our clients now for around about 4 years. We've been looking after them, and our special guest is the Chambers Director. She is the chair of the Education Committee at the Institute of Barristers Clerks, and she is also vice chair of the Bar Representation Committee for the Bar Council. So I'm very pleased to welcome Sarah to the webinar. There's a lot of titles there, Sarah.
There is. No day passes without a meeting of one form or another, as you can imagine.
Okay, no, I can imagine so. So as I say, I guess I want to spend more time with you speaking than me, and talking about experiences and stuff. But I guess just for the audience, and there are various people from various sectors, just tell us a little bit about, you know, the Chambers, where you are, what you do, and so on and so forth. A little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working with the bar for 18 years now. I was formerly at a human rights set of chambers. I came to Old Square 12 years ago, initially as head of administration, and have worked my way up to Chambers Director. Obviously in a ever-changing, ever-evolving at pace environment, particularly in respect of technology, which is how I find myself here today, being the person responsible in Chambers for everything from IT and human resources to GDPR, complaints handling, and so on. For those who aren't familiar with the Chambers dynamic, it is a little bit different in that we essentially function as a cooperative. So we have an employed staffing team, and our team is around 17 people, but we also have self-employed barristers, and we currently have 82 self-employed barristers working with Chambers. Our role as a staffing team, and as a sort of a Chambers as an organisation, is to support those barristers in all and everything that they may need in order to deliver their practice and to focus on their advocacy, which can be a little bit tricky, as you can imagine, with 82 people working with you whose role it is in life to argue for a living. So it can make it a little bit tricky, but I do sort of I do go home on rare occasions and pat myself on the back for winning an argument with a barrister, because I feel like that's one of the greatest accolades that I could ask for, particularly when it comes to IT and cybersecurity, as you might imagine. The practice areas in particular that we focus on are mixed civil. So we focus on employment law, personal injury, clinical negligence, and professional discipline. I mentioned those simply because, as you can imagine, we have responsibility for a huge volume of personal and highly sensitive personal data from a GDPR perspective, which means that not only do we recognise that it makes us potentially a bigger target, so to speak, from a cybersecurity perspective, but it also means that the potential consequences of a successful cyber attack would be very damaging for us reputationally. Hence the focus on cybersecurity.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for that. And I suppose then, because of your setup, with you having, as you say, an administrative hub of employed staff, but then self-employed people, but all having access into those systems, that comes with challenges when it comes to cyber. So at that time, what sort of challenges did you feel that you had, I suppose?
I think the biggest challenge for us, and I recognise this won't be the same across all professional services dynamics, but the biggest challenge for us is that the expected dynamic in a chambers for a large part is having a BYOD policy in place, allowing barristers to use within reason whatever hardware they want to use to be able to deliver their services and their practice. As you can imagine, that comes with a huge amount of challenges in terms of making sure that those devices are managed properly, and that the users are taking real ownership and responsibility for those devices, which is largely where we were when I first joined Chambers, of members sort of being expected to run their updates and being expected to report things, but without any real sort of organisation to that. So certainly when I first started, that was something that was of concern. But I think, again, 12 years ago, the market was very different. Whilst we'd all heard of cybersecurity and ransomware and so on, it probably wasn't anywhere near as high up on the list as, in hindsight, it should have been. Technology then moved on at an incredible pace, which I'm sure lots of organisations have struggled to keep up with, particularly when you're self-managing those services as opposed to having specialist sort of services or individuals employed by your organisation. And the smaller the organisation, the less chance you have of being able to do that. What struck me particularly for our sector around that sort of 4 or 5 year marker was that we were in the process of experiencing a really tumultuous market in terms of IT suppliers. Because we're quite specialist, there's always been sort of 4 or 5 suppliers at the time that Chambers would default to, and there was a lot of change going on at that time, which made, certainly from my perspective, it made me feel quite vulnerable because I didn't feel that I could rely on the services that we had contracted entirely. Because of the increase in cybersecurity awareness and cybersecurity threats, and in fact successful attacks within our sector, we also found there was a huge increase in demand for client reassurance, whether that be supplier questionnaires that we were asked to complete, where they would send 120 questions wanting to know every possible thing about your IT structure and dynamic to give them reassurance around the data that we were being entrusted with, or whether that was actually written into contracts on occasion as well in terms of expectations of barristers. All things that we wanted to be able to answer, but again, just felt that little bit vulnerable because we didn't feel that everything was perhaps as joined up or as transparent as perhaps we'd like it to be. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to ask a couple of questions around that, if I can, because you've given us loads of. So you were talking about the fact that initially you had your IT provider looking after you as you were. I get that obviously there were some big high-profile attacks in your sector, probably just before we met actually, and obviously people weren't doing as much, because you're quite right. I think people weren't quite as au fait about cyber and whether it should be a thing to worry about. Why did you feel that the IT or your MSP, whichever you prefer, why did you feel that they weren't, that what they provided wasn't sufficient, and why you didn't just want to leave it to them?
I think there's a couple of different strands to that. I think it's very difficult to rely on the company that is required to provide you with services to essentially self-audit, because I think there is a tendency to assume that processes and procedures are being followed. But as we all know, where there are humans involved, that's not necessarily going to be the case. So I think for me that created a little bit of a conflict of interest, as I say, because the market was quite tumultuous at the time as well. It meant that perhaps I had less confidence in our MSP in being able to deliver the joined up approach that we would have wanted to both proactive and reactive responses to cybersecurity. Another thing that sort of cropped up for us at the time was that our MSP, and I know lots of MSPs do this, moved to selling cybersecurity essentially as a separate service to us, or at least tried to. So from my perspective, I was looking at it on the basis that they were looking to increase our costs to undertake what in my mind was something that should already have been happening in the first place, which just left me feeling quite exposed. So it sort of moved me in a direction of actually, how comfortable do I feel about the IT provider who perhaps I don't have entire confidence in, because I'm not a specialist. I can't look at the back end of our IT systems and say with absolutely no doubt that everything that should be in place is in place. Checking their own homework in that respect. I know that's one of your catchphrases, Kerry, and in fact that was probably one of the first conversations that we had when we came on board. So it was very much aligned with our own way of thinking around that. It's not intended to be any kind of slight on our towards our MSP at all. Everyone we've worked with is great. But again, where there are humans, there is the potential for things to go wrong. Let's face it, when there aren't humans, there's potential for things to go wrong and for things to be missed. So the more eyes you have that are not directly associated with each other, I think the more reassuring that can be. And I think that was then sort of doubled down really for us, that when we did undertake our pen testing and when there were great big long lists of action points of, fairly minor things, but still things that needed to be addressed, when I then see them pop up on year 2, when I've been told that they have been completed and I have no way of verifying they've been completed, that again really sort of raised some, maybe not red flags, but certainly not green flags for me. So hence we were then looking to partner with an organisation that could really help us through that process.
Okay, yeah, that gives a good insight as to why you came on. And actually, I think just for me to expand on that a little bit, I don't know if the people that have joined today are aware, but the government release statistics about cyber breaches each year on businesses, and last year, 43% of UK businesses were the victims of some form of cyber breach or attack. 43%, so that's quite a lot. It's almost that you've got a 1 in 2 chance of being the victim of cyber crime. And what's interesting is the year before, so in 2024, the breach survey produced exactly the same figure, 43%. And it amounts to about 600,000 businesses that were victims of cybercrime in those 2 years. And what we've seen, and something that just resonated with me there, Sarah, is that you said, the MSP is selling me more kit constantly and have moved into cyber. And certainly our experience, and I think what the statistics are showing us is spending has gone like that on cybersecurity technology. People are spending more, they're doing more, but cybercrime hasn't come down. And we're firmly of the belief here at Mitigo that all of the things that you just said is that there is a conflict when it comes to self-audit or marking your own homework. I think you can take that further. I think it's important to recognize that it's a different discipline. The qualifications that cyber consultants would take would be different to what IT people would take. As you rightly said, you could be perfectly happy with your MSP. A lot of people that we talk to like their IT provider, but the point we make is, yes, but what are they qualified in? They're qualified in IT delivery, and yet what you really need, if you want to understand how cyber criminals think and what they're going to do once they get into your systems, you need to train and qualify from that perspective. So that certainly strikes a chord with me, what you were saying. You mentioned client assurance and questionnaires, and I know that between the Bar Council and the Law Society there's a questionnaire, but that side, are you still experiencing quite a few cybersecurity questionnaires from your clients? Do we help with those sorts of things?
We absolutely do receive more questionnaires than we would like, and I'm sure we're not alone in that. Very few firms that we deal with actually do rely solely on the established template that was put together by the Law Society and Bar Council, and there's very often supplementary questions. It's quite an interesting one that actually, from my perspective, and others may disagree with this, but I have now taken the view that in most instances, beyond acknowledging that we have policies in place for various questions that we are asked, that actually I consider that information to be confidential. And that's largely, at least in part, down to the education journey that I've had with Mitigo, around thinking about risk and cybersecurity risk in a very different way. So I'm afraid I'm a little bit mean and do sometimes sort of turn those questionnaires on their head and sort of say, well, I have no guarantee that you're going to keep this data secure, which if I were to answer all these questions would actually put us in a really exposed position, because you will then have, you know, a real understanding of our IT framework. So, you know, you first, essentially. And I'm pleased to say I very rarely get any pushback on that. But it, you know, it's part of that education journey, I think, with Mitigo, and really looking at cybersecurity, not just from an operational perspective, but from a more strategic risk management perspective, that has caused me to think, no, actually, I don't think that is valid information for you to have on file.
Wow, that's I hadn't seen it from that perspective. I know we had a chat obviously before this session, but yeah, I suppose that's a good point. If you're going to give them in-depth detail about what your security looks like, they need to prove that if they're going to hold that information on their systems, it needs to be robust as well. So yeah, but very interesting. It leads me on to think about incident response plans. We see a lot of organizations keep them on their systems, and we sit there thinking, yeah, but if your system's been corrupted or encrypted, the chances of you being able to get to that incident response plan are slim. And secondly, the truth is that the threat actors could also read those as well. So perhaps if anybody's storing if you haven't got an incident response plan, by the way, and quite a lot of businesses don't, I'd urge you to get one. But if you do have one, I'd urge you to keep it on a piece of paper separately in a file in a lock cabinet, like I see behind Sarah there on screen. So you've given us kind of some slight little snippets as to how we help you. You've certainly given us some reasons as to why you chose to partner with us. But can you sort of expand a bit on how you feel your journey has been and how we've helped you, Chambers, just in general? What's that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's again, there's a number of strands to this. I think the biggest benefit to me and to my team, as a result of our relationship with Mitigo, is that we don't feel as vulnerable as we did before, because we know we've got specialists that we can call. I haven't got 6 different numbers to push on my phone before I get through to somebody who may be able to help me with something, particularly if you're in sort of crisis mode. And I think most importantly, it's the reassurance. It's the reassurance that Mitigo give us in terms of being our service partners and are there to help us, not to criticize us. I think when you're not an expert in these areas, it can feel very, because of those vulnerabilities, you can feel quite sort of criticized in terms of, well, why didn't you know this and why didn't you know that, around your IT dynamic and your infrastructure. And actually, you know, I'm a big believer, and anyone who's ever attended any other talks that I've done for the IBC or otherwise, my sort of one of my taglines is that, particularly in professional services formats, and I know that with a number of professional services organisations online today, we rely on individuals outsourcing and companies outsourcing for specialist advice and for specialist support in order to actually to run our own businesses. It's quite literally what our business model looks like. As a Chambers, as you can imagine, more often than not, people come to us after the horse has bolted, so to speak, for that specialist advice. We are very much focused on wanting to make sure that we recognise we're not specialists in everything, and that actually outsourcing for specific things helps us to manage the risk. It's not a weakness, it's actually a strength. And we just saw Mitigo as sort of the perfect partner for that. You know, Mitigo have a really good presence in our sector, and I know other professional services sectors as well, in terms of awareness of our business models, awareness of the challenges that we might face. You know, there's pages and pages and reams and books out there in terms of what you should be doing in terms of cybersecurity, but working out and understanding how to apply it to your own particular dynamics is not always the easiest task. And I really feel that Mitigo has helped us to understand that and to recognise our real pinch points and our high risks versus those that actually it's okay sometimes to turn around and say that, you know, we're aware of this risk, but because of our business setup, we are choosing to accept that risk as opposed to feeling that we have to fix everything immediately. And I think just that real sense of partnership has been a real plus point for us, because if anything, it's made me feel more empowered to make decisions around cybersecurity as opposed to frightened, which I think, because it's such a big topic and because you're trusted with so much, can leave you in that position.
Sorry, I know I've interrupted you again.
No,
I've
not
got
at all.
a habit of that today. I think
Don't worry, I've got a habit of talking too much as well, so please feel free.
Not at all. I think what struck a chord with me there is we see a lot of organizations, and one of the first things they say to us is, yeah, but we've got a lot of cybersecurity in place. You know, we've spent money, we've invested heavily in that, which I spoke about a moment ago. But the fact is people still have blind spots. It's about understanding, as you said, it's understanding what that risk really looks like. What is it that you haven't considered or that your MSP isn't aware of? And that might not always be a technical control. It could be a behavioral control, a business process control, because remember, threat actors need to get into your system, and what they tend to do is aim at the human beings. So it'll be phishing emails, it might be phone calls, it could be all manner of things. Yes, they'll also attack the tech directly as well, and those are all the sort of surfaces that we're looking at of how they get in. But I think what was interesting there is what you said is, you know, it isn't always about changing what you do. It's about understanding this is what the risk profile looks like, this is what you could do about it, and then making an informed decision about whether you do change a configuration, implement a policy, or spend some more money. And I think a lot of organizations start with the let's spend more money first, which isn't much, it's not really a strategy, is it? The strategy should be driven by understanding and then saying, I now understand the problem, therefore I can work out what that strategy should be. So I know I interrupted you. I didn't know if there was anything you wanted to finish on that point about your journey, or whether you were coming to the end of it.
I think coming to the end of it, as I say, I think you know, what I found great about Mitigo as well was in terms of how you interacted with our MSP. I think that can leave you feeling a little bit vulnerable when you're looking at IT services and vulnerabilities. You don't want to find yourself in a position where you're conflicting with your MSP because you're so heavily reliant on them. And actually, Mitigo's approach and the way that they look at what's been identified in terms of audits and how we then go about addressing those is actually really refreshing. You're not then found you don't find yourself playing referee between two parties. It genuinely is. It does come across as being a really sort of gentle approach, but also knowing that Mitigo have the technical knowledge to question in the right places. Again, if you're from a non-technical background, if your IT provider says, "Oh, we can't change that permission because of X, Y, and Z," you're not really in a position to question that. But when you've got Mitigo partnering with you and engaged in those meetings, and the way that they approach it, of, well, actually, you know, if this were engaged, then that then gives you the flexibility to be able to do this, as opposed to, you know, being potentially sort of antagonistic, which is something I've seen in these kinds of exercises in the past. It means you're more likely to actually make progress and to reduce your risks by that sort of collegiality between the parties. So that was just something else that I wanted to mention.
You know, that's a good point, and we like to think that's the case. So it's nice to hear that you feel that way, and your IT provider does, because we're not there to catch them out. We're there to do our job. They're there to do our job, and we work together. So that's positive. So I noticed we've just got a few minutes left before we take. I can see that there's a question or two that's come through. I suppose from my perspective, I know when I met you, and it is, crikey, it is over 4 years ago when we first discussed our services. It wasn't that you didn't take this seriously anyway. There was a culture of, you know, you had a mindset around cybersecurity. How do you feel, if at all, how do you feel the culture within the set has changed or improved?
That's an interesting question, actually, particularly in a dynamic, as you can imagine, with barristers. Changing culture is not necessarily an easy task, and I'm a big believer in the sort of the the slow and steady approach when it comes to culture change in dynamics like ours. And I don't want them to be arguing with me about it either, so it makes it much easier to go slow and steady. But I think that, you know, we've been lucky enough that the way in which we've engaged with Mitigo, and that's largely been led by Mitigo, has meant that we have sort of drip fed Mitigo's presence to our members. We've introduced a sandbox facility to make sure that members know that they can pop over anything to do with anything they receive that they don't think they should have done to Mitigo, and they get a really prompt response, and that again gives them reassurance in terms of the responsiveness, which then means they're more likely to use it rather than take the risk of clicking on something and hoping for the best, which obviously is something we're all trying to avoid. I think through that approach, through the phishing tests, through the messaging we've undertaken internally, and through the way in which Mitigo has responded to the rare issues that we have had, I think it's reduced the fear factor a little bit amongst our members and amongst, particularly amongst staff and junior staff. I think there's always that kind of fear factor of that gets drummed into people at an induction. You know, if you click something you shouldn't, or if your mouse starts moving by itself, or if something pops up, you know, you must tell us immediately. I think that whereas, again, you know, if pre-Mitigo, there may have been that kind of concern of, oh goodness, you know, who do I ring? Do I tell Sarah? You know, I don't want, you know, I've clicked something I shouldn't. Am I going to be in serious trouble? Because they know they can come to Mitigo, and Mitigo will say, actually, we've checked your profile, everything's fine, or no, actually, I think we need to do this and this. And the approach and almost it sounds cheesy, but almost the warmth with which it's dealt with has actually improved the culture around cybersecurity to make it something that is just part of what we do, as opposed to something to be frightened of.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Sarah. I've got a couple of questions that I'm just gonna read out. I don't know if you or I should answer this. I might ever go first. I've never had a question start with this. It says, Iran's new supreme leader is apparently communicating by hand written messages delivered by hand to the recipient. Is there any merit in communicating by non-cyber methods where such a thing is possible? For example, I never either issue or receive bank details by electronic means. This might be regarded as antediluvian, but it is also proof against interference. So that's interesting. It's interesting, certainly when there is a breach. I will tell you, because we get, you know, what we've done with Old Square Chambers is to look at how we prevent these things from happening. But we also get clients come to us where it's all gone horribly wrong already, and what we can't do is use their internal email systems, phone systems to communicate, because we don't know how they're being monitored. So in that respect, your instant response plan, you know, should have what your communication methods are going to be should it happen. Certainly if we're dealing with solicitors, when it comes to sharing bank details, I think in my experience, a lot of people don't share them electronically and will also communicate to their clients that they will not share them electronically. But unfortunately, not everybody reads what's put in front of them, and they still fall for the information that comes to them. So nothing's foolproof is probably my response to that. But I suppose if you consider what your risk might look like and where you'll have those weaknesses, you can introduce those processes that can reduce the chances of those things happening. I don't know if, Sarah, if you've got any thoughts around that, and if you haven't, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, it's ironically, it's something that I've heard myself saying a few times actually around the rollback away to a point in terms of using IT and IT mechanisms to share certain data, because I do think there are some real benefits to that, but I think there are some downsides as well. So it really depends on what that functionality is. Whilst you're reducing the risk potentially by dealing on paper or by whatever means, you're also then potentially incurring risks around, for instance, lack of auditability in terms of communications, lack of information to then rely on at a future stage. So, for instance, if you were rather than bank details. If you're thinking about it from the perspective of chasing an age debt, you can work on the basis that you just want to keep calling that organisation, so you haven't got lots of emails that may be compromised, but then you'll have very little evidence in the event that you then needed it at a later stage. So I think there's pros and cons to each. I think it's a judgment call. I think I probably look at that less so from a cyber risk perspective and more from a GDPR DSAR perspective, rather than anything else. I think fundamentally what you need to be considering, I think, is what actually happens in the event of a cyber attack. There is the content of your data and the risks attached to that and what that exposes you to, but more importantly, possibly, is the inaccessibility of that data. So is that going to change your ability to be able to access important things? That would be my my premise on that.
Makes sense. And then one final question. So it says, like what you mentioned earlier, Kerry, that businesses are buying more and more kit to protect themselves. They are also buying insurance. But I worry whether businesses know what that insurance actually covers. I've been part of an investigation for a reseller whereby their customer, A Chambers, suffered an attack during a high-profile case, and solicitors and cyber specialists were called in by the insurers. And it is a very expensive exercise in relation to the investigation and the follow-on process. If businesses aren't covered, then they will have to take the hit. What's your view on this, if any? Well, that's absolutely it. That's the point, is understand what insurance is for. The horse has bolted if you come to rely on cyber insurance. And actually, what you should be doing as an organization is understanding what your risk profile looks like, putting the necessary controls in place, and then you use cyber insurance to offset any risk that you haven't been able to identify, so the bad luck, if you like, and then making sure you choose the right policy. Of course, if you get the policy right and you've got all of the factors right before that, the chances are you won't have to necessarily you're not going to necessarily claim on it, but the point is that you'll be mighty glad that you had it if it all goes wrong. But as I say, just understand what it will do. It is expensive if it goes wrong. We're dealing with somebody at the moment where I know their bill just to have the remediation of it was about $250,000. And that wasn't to fix the problem. That was to fix the problem, not to future-proof them going forward. But reputationally, they've lost even more than that, because it isn't always just a financial cost. In fact, sometimes the financial cost it isn't the greatest problem. It's if you've had an encryption of your systems, it's going to take months to get that back to what it looked like previously. Your clients are going to question you, they are going to leave you, and it is going to be quite painful. And that's not me scaremongering. Somebody's asked me the question, and as I say, I can talk about that from experience. And I imagine, Sarah, you living in the world that you do, you've probably got stories of other sets who have had those problems, and it's been quite painful for them.
Absolutely, and obviously we've got the added challenge in our sector that because of our dynamics in terms of the self-employed model working alongside the employed and chambers model, that actually insurance isn't actually that easy to come by within our sector, where we are such a small sector, and there have been not a high number of incidents, but from a proportionate perspective, more than most insurers would like. There are some that have either pulled out of the market entirely or have attached incredibly high premiums to the insurance offerings that they have. I think it's so difficult with insurance to make a decision on it sometimes. I think what we have to try and remember is that, as you say, insurance is there for after the fact. It's there as a mitigation, not as a preventative. And it's not going to remove the risks. It's just, if anything, I think what I see more and more so is it's used as a tool to reassure, in terms of reassuring your clients and reassuring your internal stakeholders that there will be additional support that you've been insuring against in the event that something happens. But absolutely, it can be incredibly expensive. I would really encourage people to really understand their insurance policies around cyber, to really get to grips with what you'll be covered for and check those cover levels. and check how, particularly, again, sorry, I know I keep going back to chambers, but that's my little world, particularly how you would potentially quantify any losses, particularly around income to the business, because that's, again, a really difficult one for a chambers to be able to pinpoint because of the way that we work. So I'm certainly not saying insurance isn't worth it. I absolutely think it is. And it will help to deal with some of those costs, but it would be unrealistic to think that that would be the end of the story.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, look, we've gone over, which was fairly inevitable, I think, with certainly with me. I'm just going to share my screen as we've got a poll that we want to put on. Sarah, can you tell me if I am indeed sharing my screen, because I'm not always the best person to. Can you see that?
I can see myself twice now, which is
Oh, should be able to see. Yes, I've put in that one, isn't it?
Isn't it?
So before I officially thank Sarah, but I guess I just have, but a little poll. I don't know if today has whetted your appetite to perhaps learn a little bit more about how Michigo could help your organisation. And so, as I believe, any second soon, there should be a poll that comes up on screen for you to just answer. This is: how interested are you in a free, no obligation 60-minute cyber review? And it's a very interested, somewhat interested, or not interested. And obviously, if you're interested, we'll reach out and we'll make contact, and we'll come and have a chat with you and talk about the things that we can do to help you. If however you're not sure from the poll perspective, there's some details of myself on screen if you wanted to email me or give me a call, or if you know Sarah and get my details from her, I'm sure she'd also be happy to do that. I've been a bit cheeky there by saying that, but there's some details there. So I'll take those off screen now. He said, trying to do work the magic at the same time, so that should have all disappeared. So thank you everybody for joining, but I think the biggest thanks today comes to somebody that didn't have to do this, and I'm very grateful that you did, Sarah, and we appreciate your time, and thank you for your insight as to how we've been able to help you over the last 4 years, and hopefully going forward into many more.
Not at all. It's been a pleasure. I just I think I'd probably close with another one of my sort of catchphrases, which is to say that you don't know what you don't know. And particularly around something like this all the more reason to reach out to specialists. I'm not here to do a sales pitch for Mitigo, but I found I had so much reassurance from being able to speak to them and just get a better understanding. So I would suggest taking advantage of the 60-minute freebie if you've got time.
You're a star. Thanks very much, Sarah. Okay, everybody, have a good day, and thanks very much. Cheers. Goodbye.
Take care. Thanks. Bye-bye.